The rain hammered against the cracked asphalt of the emergency room parking lot, turning the world into a blur of darkness and neon. Lila Reyes pulled her scrub jacket tighter as she stepped outside for a breath of air. The third double shift this week, weighing heavy on her shoulders. The rural Virginia hospital was understaffed, underfunded, and, tonight, unbearably quiet. The kind of quiet that made her uneasy. She was about to turn back inside when she saw him. A figure sprawled between two cars, a dark pool spreading beneath his body. Her heart lurched. Even from 15 feet away, she could see he wasn't moving, and the metallic scent of blood cut through the rain-soaked air. Protocol said to call security first, to wait for backup, to protect herself, but her father's voice echoed in her mind. The same words he'd written in his last letter. When you have the power to save a life, hesitation is its own kind of betrayal. She ran to him, her sneakers splashing through puddles, and dropped to her knees beside the dying man. His face was pale, lips tinged blue, but it was the tattoo on his exposed shoulder that made her breath catch. An eagle, anchor, and trident, unmistakable even in the dim light. A Navy SEAL. His eyes fluttered open for just a moment, unfocused and desperate, as she pressed her hands against the gunshot wound in his abdomen. Blood pulsed hot between her fingers, and she knew with terrible certainty that he had minutes, maybe less. She screamed for help, her voice raw against the storm, then made a decision that would shatter everything. Gripping him under the arms, she dragged his weight across the pavement, leaving a crimson trail behind them. Every muscle in her small frame burned, but she didn't stop until they crashed through the automatic doors into the fluorescent glare of the emergency room. The night shift staff erupted into controlled chaos around her as she barked orders, starting lines, calling for blood. Her hands moved with practiced precision, even as her mind raced. Who was this man, and why did finding him feel like fate? As she cut away his torn shirt, his hand suddenly shot up and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. His lips moved, forming words she had to lean close to hear over the beeping monitors. 7, 4, 9, 2, 1, north, he whispered, his voice like gravel and smoke. Then, barely audible, Operation Nightfall. His eyes rolled back, and the heart monitor's rhythm became erratic. She worked faster, adrenaline drowning out every question, fighting death with everything she had learned in 8 years of nursing. She didn't notice the security cameras going dark, one by one, throughout the hospital. She didn't see the headlights approaching in the distance, cutting through the rain like predators closing in. All she knew was the man dying on her table, the mystery in his final words, and the strange certainty that saving his life had just changed hers forever. Outside, 10 black SUVs were already pulling into the parking lot, their occupants armed and ready. The storm wasn't the only thing descending on the hospital tonight. The commander's pulse stabilized under Lila's trembling hands, but her mind refused to settle. Those numbers he'd whispered, 7, 4, 9, 2, 1, north, burned in her memory like a brand, demanding to be understood. She glanced at the monitor, watching the irregular rhythm slowly strengthen as the blood transfusion did its work. Around her, the ER hummed with its usual nighttime sounds, distant phones ringing, the soft squeak of cartwheels, hushed conversations at the nurse's station. But something felt wrong, a prickling awareness crawling up her spine like spider legs. When she looked up at the security camera in the corner of the trauma bay, its red recording. Light was dark, dead. That camera had been working just 20 minutes ago. Dr. Chen, the security feed just went down. She called to the attending physician, trying to keep her voice steady. He barely looked up from adjusting the IV drip, exhausted from a 14-hour shift and too tired to register alarm. Lila moved to the corner where the backup monitor sat, its screen now showing nothing but static snow. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs as she walked into the hallway and checked the next camera, then the next, all dark, all silent, as if someone had thrown a switch and blinded the entire hospital. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, twice, casting strobing shadows that made the empty corridor feel like the set of a horror film. She pulled her phone from her pocket with shaking hands, instinct screaming at her to call someone, anyone, but who would believe what she couldn't yet explain? Back in the trauma bay, the commander's eyes moved beneath closed lids, his body fighting its way back from the edge of oblivion. Lila returned to his side and checked his vitals again, her professional training warring with the growing dread in her chest. Operation Nightfall. What kind of name was that? And why had he trusted her with it in what he thought were his final moments? She reached for his wrist to check his pulse manually, and that's when she saw it beneath the blood and grime, a second tattoo on his inner forearm, small and precise. Numbers, coordinates. Her breath caught as recognition slammed into her like a physical blow, because she had seen numbers formatted exactly like that before, in her father's handwriting, in the letter that had arrived 6 months after his funeral. The automatic doors at the hospital's main entrance hissed open somewhere in the distance, followed by the synchronized thunder of boots on linoleum. Too many boots, moving with military precision. Lila's head snapped toward the sound as dread crystallized into certainty. They were here. Whoever they were, whatever this was, it had found them faster than should have been possible. The lights flickered again, and in that strobing darkness, she made a choice that would define everything to come. She stepped between the doors and the unconscious commander, her small frame suddenly an immovable wall. Outside, through the rain-streaked windows, she could see them now, 10 black SUVs arranged in a perfect perimeter, their headlights creating pools of harsh white light that turned the parking lot into an interrogation room. This was no rescue. This was a siege. The boots stopped just outside the trauma bay doors, and Lila's world contracted to the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Through the reinforced glass, she could see them, 12 figures in tactical gear, faces hard as carved stone, hands resting on holstered weapons, with the casual confidence of people who'd used them before. At their center stood a woman in a charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. When their eyes met, Lila felt the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. The woman raised one hand, a simple gesture, and the doors exploded inward with pneumatic force that made Lila flinch but not retreat. "Step away from the patient." The woman's voice was sandpaper wrapped in silk, each word clipped with the precision of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. She moved into the room like she owned it, flanked by 4 agents whose eyes swept every corner, cataloguing exits and threats with mechanical efficiency. Behind them, Lila could see hospital staff being corralled in the hallway, Dr. Chen's exhausted face now rigid with confusion and fear. The lead agent pulled a leather credential, wallet from her jacket, flipping it open to reveal a badge that caught the flickering fluorescent light, some combination of letters Lila couldn't quite read from where she stood. "I'm Special Agent Vance. This man is a matter of national security, and you are currently obstructing a federal operation." Lila's hands curled into fists at her sides, her nursing training warring with every instinct, screaming that something about this was wrong, fundamentally and dangerously wrong. "He's in critical condition," she heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt, carrying the authority of someone who'd fought death in this room 100 times before. Moving him now could restart the internal bleeding, could cause cardiac arrest, could kill him before you get him to your vehicle. She planted her feet wider, a stance her father had taught her when she was 8 years old, facing down schoolyard bullies in Manila. "Stand like a tree," he'd said, "roots deep enough that wind becomes irrelevant." Agent Vance's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, calculation mixed with annoyance. "You have 10 seconds to comply before I have you removed and charged with obstruction," Vance said, stepping closer until Lila could smell her perfume, expensive and cold like winter roses. Around them, the agent's hands shifted subtly toward their weapons, a coordinated movement that spoke of countless operations, countless moments, exactly like this. But Lila looked past Vance to the commander's pale face, remembering how he'd trusted her with his final words, how his blood had soaked into her scrubs as she dragged him from the parking lot. Behind her, the heart monitor beeped its fragile rhythm. Life hanging by threads she refused to let anyone cut. "Then charge me," she whispered. The room erupted into controlled chaos as two agents moved forward, their gloved hands reaching for Lila's arms, but Vance raised a single finger, and they froze mid-motion, like hunting dogs called to heel. "Interesting," Vance murmured, tilting her head as she studied Lila with the intensity of a scientist examining something unexpected under a microscope. "Tell me, Miss Santos, yes, I know your name, I know everything about you. Why would a Filipino nurse with $14,000 in student debt and an expired work visa risk federal charges for a man whose name you don't even know?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Lila felt ice crystallize in her stomach because she'd forgotten about the visa, forgotten that single bureaucratic failure that suddenly transformed her from healthcare worker into leverage. Vance smiled, thin and humorless. "Or perhaps you do know exactly who he is." The accusation landed like a physical blow, and suddenly the air in the trauma bay felt suffocating, thick with implications Lila couldn't fully grasp. Vance circled the commander's bed with predatory grace, her fingers trailing along the metal railing, close enough to the IV lines that Lila's muscles tensed with the urge to intervene. "Commander James Aldrich disappeared 3 weeks ago from a secure facility in Norfolk carrying intelligence that could compromise active operations across 3 continents," Vance continued, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Communications intercepts suggest a foreign operative, specifically someone with Philippine military connections, was positioned to make contact and extract information." She stopped directly across from Lila, the commander's unconscious body between them like a chess piece neither could afford to lose. "Your father served in the Philippine Navy's intelligence division before his convenient death 2 years ago." Lila's vision tunneled, the edges of the room going dark as her father's face flashed through her memory. His tired smile, his rough hands that smelled like tobacco and sea salt, the letter that arrived 3 months after his funeral with no return address. "My father was a patriot," she said, each word carved from stone, from grief, from a well of anger she'd kept buried for so long it had fermented into something dangerous. "And I'm a nurse who saved a dying man because that's what I'm sworn to do, not some spy from whatever thriller novel you're living in." But even as she spoke, doubt crept in like fog under a door. Because why had her father's final letter contained coordinates he'd never explained? Why had he written about unfinished business, about debts that transcended borders and blood? Vance's smile widened, as if she could see every thought crossing Lila's face, as if she'd already won a game Lila hadn't known she was playing. "Place her in custody," Vance commanded, and this time when the agents moved forward, no finger stopped them, their hands iron firm on Lila's shoulders as they pulled her away from the commander's bedside. The last thing Lila saw before they turned her toward the door was the heart monitor's steady beep faltering, skipping a beat like a heart forgetting how to fight, and she lunged against the agent's grip with a strength born of pure desperation. "He's crashing!" she screamed. But Vance merely nodded to a waiting medical team in federal uniforms who swept in with their own equipment, their own protocols, strangers who didn't know that the commander's blood type was rare or that his pressure had been dropping every 12 minutes like clockwork. They dragged Lila into the hallway, where Dr. Chen reached for her with helpless hands, where the fluorescent lights burned too bright, where she understood with crushing clarity that saving a life had somehow made her a suspect in a conspiracy she couldn't begin to comprehend. The interrogation room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Its cinder-block walls painted that particular shade of institutional beige that existed only in government facilities and fever dreams, and Lila sat handcuffed to a metal table that felt cold even through her scrubs as the minutes stretched into hours. They'd left her alone deliberately. She understood that much. Isolation was its own form of pressure, meant to crack resolve like ice expanding in stone. But the silence gave her something more dangerous than fear. Time to think. Her father's letter materialized in her memory with the clarity of a photograph she'd studied 10,000 times, the one that arrived in a manila envelope with Philippine postage, but no return address, his handwriting shakier than she remembered, as if he'd written it while the world was moving beneath him. She'd memorized every word during those first raw months of grief, reading it like scripture, like a map to understanding why he'd died in a training accident that nobody would fully explain. And now, in this sterile room, those words took on new dimensions, new shadows. The coordinates had been written in the margin almost as an afterthought: 14 degrees, 23 minutes north, 120 degrees, 18 minutes east. Numbers she'd looked up once and found only open ocean in the South China Sea, before dismissing them as navigation notes from some old mission. But the commander had whispered numbers too, hadn't he, in those desperate moments before consciousness left him, his lips forming digits with the precision of a man for whom such sequences meant survival. 14, 23, 120, 18. The matching pattern hit her like voltage, her breath catching audibly in the empty room, because coincidence didn't stretch that far, didn't cross oceans and years and the space between a dying father and a bleeding stranger. Her father's letter had mentioned an unfinished mission, an American ally who understood that some promises transcended flags and borders, that honor was a currency that never devalued, words that had seemed poetic then, but now rang with operational clarity. Lila's hands trembled against the handcuffs as understanding assembled itself piece by terrible piece. Her father had known Commander Aldrich, had worked with him on something classified enough to follow them both to their respective ends, had somehow known that one day his daughter might need to recognize those coordinates like a password. The letter's final line echoed through her skull with new urgency. If the numbers ever find you, trust the man who carries them. And she'd thought it was grief talking, her father's mind wandering in his final days, but dying men didn't waste words on nonsense. They'd targeted her not because she was guilty, but because she was connected, a thread leading back to whatever her father and the commander had discovered 2 decades ago in those empty waters, and Vance's accusations suddenly felt less like investigation and more like elimination. The door's lock clicked with metallic finality, and Lila's head snapped up, her decision crystallizing in that instant before the handle turned. She couldn't let them separate her from the commander, couldn't let whatever truth her father had died protecting vanish into classified files and convenient accidents. When the junior agent entered carrying a clipboard and wearing that practiced expression of bureaucratic boredom, Lila was already calculating distances, angles, the exact pressure point on a human wrist that her father had taught her one summer when she was 16 and thought self-defense was just another game they played. The junior agent barely had time to register movement before Lila twisted in her chair with the precision her father had drilled into muscle memory, her legs sweeping his ankle in a calculated arc that sent him sprawling against the concrete floor. She grabbed his keyring before he could shout, uncuffing herself with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear, and was through the door while his surprised grunt still echoed off cinder-block walls. The hospital corridor stretched before her in fluorescent-lit panels, familiar territory transformed into hostile landscape. And she moved with purpose toward the ICU where they'd taken Commander Aldrich, knowing she had minutes at most before alarms turned those minutes into seconds. Her scrubs became camouflage among the medical staff still working despite the lockdown. Her badge still clipped to her chest like a permission slip to belong, and she slipped past 2 agents examining their phones instead of the faces around them. Commander Aldrich lay exactly where she'd left him, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, but something nagged at her trained eye as she approached, a wrongness in how the bandages sat, an asymmetry in the dressings she'd applied with meticulous care hours earlier. Lila's hands moved to the wound site on his lower abdomen, the one she'd irrigated and packed and documented, except now the packing felt different, denser, like someone had disturbed her work. She peeled back the gauze with trembling fingers and found it immediately. A secondary wound, deliberately concealed beneath her original dressing, a small incision that her initial trauma assessment had missed in the chaos of saving his life. The object embedded in the muscle tissue gleamed under surgical lights when she extracted it with forceps, a microchip no larger than a grain of rice, sealed in medical-grade polymer and still warm from his body heat. Understanding crashed through her like cold water because those agents had examined him, had processed him, had run their hands over every inch of his unconscious body and somehow missed this. Except they hadn't missed it. They'd hidden it, buried it deeper beneath her own bandaging where it would stay invisible until they could remove him from the hospital and retrieve it somewhere without witnesses. Leela's mind raced through implications. If the agents knew about the chip, knew its location, then someone among them needed it to stay secret, needed the commander silenced before he could reveal what information it contained. The traitor wasn't coming from outside. They were already inside, wearing government credentials and speaking with authority that made people obey without question. The monitor's rhythm changed as Commander Aldrich's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with the clarity of a man surfacing from deep water, and his hand moved weakly toward the wound she'd just exposed. "You found it," he whispered, his voice carrying relief and warning in equal measure, and Lila understood with chilling certainty that she'd just made herself a target. She palmed the microchip as footsteps approached from the corridor, her father's words burning through memory. "Trust the man who carries the numbers," and made the split-second choice to trust this stranger with her life. "Your father," the commander breathed, his grip surprisingly strong on her wrist. "He made me promise to protect you if this day ever came, and I've been trying to keep that promise for 20 years. The words hung between them, like a bridge across 2 decades, and Lila felt her breath catch as the commander's eyes, grey as storm clouds over Manila Bay, held hers with an intensity that spoke of debts unpaid and promises carved into conscience. "South China Sea 20 years ago," he continued, each word costing him visible effort as pain medication fought against his need to speak. "Your father was liaison officer on a joint training exercise when our helicopter went down in contested waters, 3 of us in the ocean with Chinese patrol, boats closing in, and my leg shattered from the crash." His fingers trembled against her wrist, not from weakness but from the weight of memory, and she recognized the look of a man who'd carried guilt like stones in his pockets for far too long. Lieutenant Santos didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the diplomatic incident it would cause. He commandeered a fishing boat and pulled us out under cover of fog while his career hung in the balance, then disappeared into reassignment before I could properly thank him. The monitors beeped steadily while Lila's world tilted sideways, her father's face swimming up through years of absence, and suddenly those letters he'd sent made terrible, beautiful sense. "He wrote me before he died," Lila whispered, her voice breaking on words she'd never understood until this moment. "Said he'd made friendships that transcended flags, and that someday someone might come asking about promises kept across oceans." The microchip felt impossibly heavy in her palm, this tiny object that men would kill. And she understood now why her father had trained her in things most nurses never learned: escape tactics and observation skills, and the ability to read danger in a room's geometry. Commander Aldrich nodded slowly, his hand moving to touch the tattoo on his shoulder, the trident and anchor she'd noticed when dragging him from the parking lot's darkness. "He asked me to watch over you from a distance, to be there if you ever needed protection from the world he'd touched, but tried to keep you separate from." he said. And tears she hadn't cried at her father's funeral suddenly burned hot behind her eyes. The commander's mission wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about honoring a debt to a man who'd risked everything for strangers because it was right, because some promises mattered more than consequences. Operation Nightfall was his. The commander breathed as footsteps grew louder in the corridor beyond, and Lila realized the numbers he'd whispered weren't just coordinates, but her father's final message encoded in their sequence. He spent his career building a network of allies who believed in protecting people over politics, sailors and soldiers who'd put humanity before nationalism when the chips were down. The irony of that phrase hit her as she clutched the actual chip containing evidence of those who'd betrayed everything her father built, who'd sold secrets and lives for money, while good people died keeping promises. Commander Aldrich's eyes hardened, despite his weakened state, the warrior surfacing through the patient as danger approached. The woman leading those agents out there, Agent Morrison, she's the one who had your father killed when he discovered her activities, made it look like an accident, and I've spent 3 years gathering proof while pretending not to know. The revelation struck Lila like voltage, transforming grief into something sharp and focused, and she understood why this stranger had staged his own disappearance and trusted a random Filipino nurse with everything. The door burst open as Lila pocketed the microchip and moved to stand between the commander and whoever came through next, her father's training singing through her muscles and his promise echoing in her heart. Agent Morrison entered with weapon drawn and cold calculation in her expression, but Lila saw her clearly now. Not as authority, but as the woman who'd stolen her father's life, and would have to go through his daughter to finish what she'd started. "Step away from the patient, Miss Santos," Morrison said with false courtesy stretched thin over threat, and Lila felt her father's presence like a hand on her shoulder as she planted her feet and refused to move. The commander's labored breathing steadied behind her. Two people, united by a promise made in salt water and kept through decades, and she knew with absolute certainty that some debts transcended death and some daughters were raised specifically for moments like this one. Agent Morrison's weapon remained steady, but Lila noticed the micro-tremble in her trigger finger, the tell of someone who'd crossed lines so many times that hesitation had become a foreign language, replaced by calculation dressed in bureaucratic authority. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into," Morrison said, her voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone accustomed to making problems disappear into paperwork and unmarked graves. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, as if the building itself sensed the violence coiling in the sterile air, and Lila heard her father's voice in memory, teaching her that real courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it dictate surrender. Behind her, Commander Aldrich shifted slightly, and she felt rather than saw him reaching for the call button that would flood this room with witnesses, with people whose presence might stay Morrison's hand long enough for truth to matter. The other agents began filtering into the doorway, their faces showing confusion as they sensed something wrong in their commander's posture, in the way she aimed her weapon at a nurse rather than protecting her. Morrison's eyes went cold as winter ocean as she realized her window of clean elimination was closing, that soon she'd have to choose between exposure and a massacre that would be impossible to explain away. "The microchip, Miss Santos," she demanded, with voice like razor blade wrapped in silk, "before this becomes messier than it needs to be for everyone in this hospital." Lila's hands stayed visible but empty, her nursing training dictating she show no threatening movements, while her father's lessons reminded her that violence favored the prepared, and Morrison had already committed to a path that ended in blood. "The cameras are back online," Lila said quietly, a bluff built on desperate hope and the memory of flickering security monitors, watching Morrison's expression crack just slightly around the edges. The admission cost Morrison a fraction of a second's distraction as her eyes flicked toward the camera mount in the corner, and Lila moved with speed, born from years of emergency response, grabbing the IV stand beside the bed and swinging it. In a silver arc that caught Morrison's wrist with a crack of metal on bone. The weapon discharged into the ceiling tiles with a sound like thunder in the enclosed space, and suddenly everything became motion and shouting as the agents in the hallway realized their commander had just fired on a civilian. Commander Aldrich lurched upright despite his injuries, his voice carrying decades of command authority as he shouted coordinates and case numbers that named Morrison's crimes in language the loyal agents understood immediately. Morrison's face transformed from cold control to cornered desperation, and she lunged not for her dropped weapon, but for Lila's throat. 20 years of killing, rendered down to hands, seeking a neck to silence the witness who'd unraveled everything. Lila twisted, using the IV stand as barrier and fulcrum, her father's training flowing through muscle memory as she redirected Morrison's momentum into the bed frame with a hollow thud that ended the immediate threat. The loyal agents swarmed in with weapons, drawn and voices overlapping in commands and questions, their training sorting threat from victim as Morrison struggled against hands that pulled her away from Lila with the shocked realization of betrayal. Agent Park, the younger operative who'd been Morrison's shadow all night, stared at his former commander with the devastated expression of someone watching their certainties crumble into conspiracy and lies. She killed Lieutenant Santos. Commander Aldrich gasped, through pain that had broken past his medication, his finger pointing at Morrison with the weight of witness testimony and collected evidence. Morrison's face went blank as the mask she'd worn for years dissolved, leaving only the calculating predator who'd traded lives for money and wrapped murder in national security classifications. The microchip in Lila's pocket felt like her father's vindication, proof that his death hadn't been accident, but assassination, and that the daughter he'd raised had completed the mission he'd started by simply refusing to step aside. The hospital's lockdown alarm began wailing as someone activated emergency protocols, and Lila realized the building was now sealed with Morrison trapped inside the truth she'd killed to conceal. Outside the window, dawn began breaking over Virginia hills, and Lila watched Morrison being restrained and read rights that would unravel years of corruption, while her father's promise echoed complete across the distance between living and dead, between Manila and America, between a nurse's compassion and a warrior's final stand. The chaos in Commander Aldrich's room rippled outward through the hospital corridors like shockwaves from an explosion, and Lila knew that Morrison's network wouldn't collapse without desperate final moves from operatives still loyal to money rather than country. She pulled the microchip from her pocket and pressed it into Agent Park's trembling hand, watching his face transform from shock to grim determination as he understood the weight of evidence now burning against his palm. "Get that to whoever." "You trust absolutely," Lila said with urgency, sharpening each word, "because Morrison didn't work alone, and the people she answers to will burn this building down before they let it reach the right hands." The young agent nodded and disappeared into the hallway filled with responding security personnel, while Commander Aldrich gripped Lila's wrist, with surprising strength for someone who'd nearly died twice in one night. "Your father taught you well," he whispered, through pain that lined his face like combat scars made fresh. "But you need to disappear into this hospital until my people secure the perimeter, because Morrison's handlers are already moving." Outside the window, Lila spotted 2 unmarked vans pulling into the emergency bay with the predatory precision of cleaners arriving to erase problems, and she realized the commander was right. They'd come to eliminate witnesses and evidence before dawn's light made murder complicated. Lila helped Aldrich back onto the bed, despite his protests, her nursing instincts overriding the adrenaline screaming through her veins as she checked his vitals with hands that had steadied from combat back into clinical competence. The hospital's layout mapped itself in her mind like territory she'd walked 1,000 nights. Service corridors and supply closets, stairwells that bypassed main floors, the morgue tunnel connecting to the old wing where cameras had dead zones maintenance kept promising to fix. "I need you to stay alive," she told the commander with fierce intensity borrowed from every patient she'd fought to save. "Because you're the only witness who outranks their security clearances, and without your testimony, this all disappears into classified files and convenient accidents." He nodded understanding, and she saw in his weathered face the same determined honor her father had worn in faded photographs, the kind of integrity that made promises across decades and kept them at personal cost. The sound of boots echoed in the hallway, moving with tactical precision rather than hospital security's uncertain response. And Lila knew Morrison's people had arrived wearing stolen credentials and murderous intent. She grabbed the crash cart by the door, positioning it as both barrier and weapon, while her mind calculated angles and distances with the cold clarity fear sometimes crystallizes into survival mathematics. The fluorescent lights flickered again, as if electricity itself recoiled from the violence gathering in sterile corridors designed for healing. And Lila heard her father's voice teaching her that retreat wasn't cowardice when it preserved the mission over ego. She triggered the nurse call system that would flood the station with alerts, creating confusion and drawing genuine staff toward their location, forcing Morrison's cleaners to either abort or commit to massacre in front of witnesses. Through the narrow window in the door, she watched 3 figures in tactical gear moving with the fluid coordination of professional operators. Their weapons held low but ready, faces obscured by the dim emergency lighting that painted everything in shades of threat and shadow. Commander Aldrich reached beneath his pillow and produced a backup weapon that hospital security had somehow missed, his hands moving with muscle memory that transcended injury as he chambered a round with quiet finality. "They're not taking either of us," he stated with the absolute certainty of someone who'd already decided which lines couldn't be crossed, "and they're not burying your father's truth in the same grave they planned for mine." The tactical team reached the door, and Lila pressed herself against the wall beside the frame, her heart hammering against ribs that seemed too fragile to contain the moment's violent possibility. The door exploded inward with boots and shouted commands designed to overwhelm resistance through shock and volume. But Lila was already moving, shoving the crash cart into the first figure's knees with force that sent him sprawling into his teammates' line of fire. Commander Aldrich's weapon spoke twice with controlled precision that dropped the second operative, while Lila grabbed the fallen man's tactical vest and used his body as shield against the third shooter whose hesitation cost him everything. The genuine hospital security arrived in a flood of confused personnel and drawn weapons, their presence transforming Morrison's clean elimination into a chaotic standoff that collapsed when Agent Park returned with federal marshals whose jurisdiction superseded everyone's authority. In the sudden stillness after violence, Lila looked down at her shaking hands and realized she'd honored her father's legacy not through warfare, but through the stubborn refusal to let corruption win, through saving a life that proved powerful enough to expose years of buried treason, through being exactly who he'd raised her to become, someone who stood ground when standing mattered more than safety. The ceremony took place 6 months after the night that transformed Lila from an anonymous night shift nurse into someone whose name appeared in classified briefings, read by admirals and senators behind locked doors. The room wasn't grand, just a modest conference space in a nondescript building outside Washington, where autumn light filtered through bulletproof windows, illuminating faces of people whose identities would never appear in public records, but whose work shaped the silence between wars. Commander Aldrich stood in full dress uniform, bearing new commendations that told stories he'd never be permitted to share, his posture military straight, despite scars that still pulled tight across healed wounds. And when he pinned the Navy Commendation Medal to Lila's civilian dress, His hands trembled with emotion that Rank couldn't quite contain. "Your father would have been impossibly proud," he whispered in a voice roughened by gratitude and survivor's weight. "Because you finished what he started 27 years ago, when he pulled a drowning American sailor from dark water and changed the course of both our lives." Lila touched the medal with fingertips that had sutured wounds and disabled attackers, feeling its weight as connection rather than decoration, understanding that courage sometimes looked like simply refusing to abandon someone bleeding in a parking lot. After the formal presentations concluded and the senior officers departed in their armored vehicles, Commander Aldrich handed Lila a folder containing documents declassified specifically for her. Letters her father had written to naval intelligence proposing networks of trusted individuals across Pacific nations who could act as bridges during crises that politics made officially impossible. Operation Nightfall wasn't about espionage, Aldrich explained, while coffee cooled between them in cups neither quite remembered pouring. It was about building human connections that survived governments and conflicts, finding people like your father who understood that protecting others transcended flags and borders. The photographs showed her father younger than memory preserved him, standing beside American officers and Filipino commanders, Japanese analysts and Australian operatives, all united by belief that some promises mattered more than convenient nationalism. Lila recognized in those captured faces the same determined integrity she'd seen reflected in the commander's eyes during their desperate hospital standoff, the quality that made strangers into allies and turned individual courage into legacy that outlived single lifetimes. The offer came wrapped in careful words about humanitarian task forces and diplomatic medical initiatives, positions that didn't officially exist but operated in spaces between military action and civilian aid, where people like Lila's father had always worked best. "We need nurses who understand that saving lives sometimes requires tactical thinking," Aldrich said with smile that acknowledged the absurdity of recruiting someone through near-death experience. "And we need people who've proven they'll stand ground when standing costs everything, because that's exactly who your father trained you to become." Lila thought about the quiet Virginia hospital where she'd pulled a dying stranger from darkness, about the choice that seemed impossibly simple in the moment: see someone bleeding and help them, yet rippled outward into consequences that toppled conspiracies and honored promises made across oceans. She looked at the medal catching autumn light and realized her answer had been written years ago in her father's letters, in his faith that individual acts of courage could change trajectories that policies and politicians never touched. "I accept," Lila said, and felt her father's presence like hands on shoulders, steadying her for missions yet unnamed. "Because some promises deserve to be kept across generations, and because he taught me that. Healing and protecting are just different words for the same stubborn refusal to let darkness win." Commander Aldrich nodded with satisfaction that looked like relief, like hope, like the closing of circles that began in dark water 27 years prior, when a Filipino naval officer saved an American sailor and planted seeds that grew into networks spanning nations. Would you risk everything to save a stranger's life? Subscribe to witness more stories where courage changes everything.